I'd not heard of the National Association of Scholars until I was invited to talk about the relationship between academia and the military, with special reference to the question of the Reserve Officers Training Corps, the ROTC, and with reference, perhaps only illustrative, to my own experience with that matter at Columbia University, where I teach. I faithfully attended all the sessions that preceded this one, and decided, at the risk of running over my time, to preface what I have to say about some remarks that bear on earlier themes. Columbia is, it can be fairly claimed, at least, the mother of courses in Western civilization, and it has never ceased to require 3 year-long sequences of all undergraduates in the college focused on the culture of Western civilization. I teach in 2 of those courses, alternatively, one in literature that begins with Gilgamesh, the Bible, and the Greeks, and by the beginning of the spring term has reached Virgil. The other on politics and social theory and philosophy, key texts from them, which by the spring has reached Rousseau. These courses involve original texts only, no secondary sources. It's Wednesday, so it must be Kant, is a typical kind of experience. They are team taught by large staffs in small sections, no more than 22 students. It's become a sacred number. The subjects we talk about as a staff are overwhelmingly on the texts, on the materials, how to teach them best, sharing experience. We don't just, in the informal culture, contemporary politics doesn't come up much. I would be pleased but surprised to discover that among the scores who teach in these courses, there are more than a few voters for McCain. Indeed, if I were asked to guess on the basis of general atmosphere, the modal teacher is more or less like me, a left liberal, perhaps more to the left, perhaps more centrist. What Carrie Nelson said the other day about politics not mapping well onto academic matters, I find certainly true. There are attempts, and they continue, to diversify, to globalize, to therapize, if I can draw on a wonderful expression of the other day. Resisting them, I've had the occasion to say, I found myself saying that these courses are not exercises in group therapy, quite literally. But based on that experience, I'd like to say that, in my experience, it's the liberals, in the political sense of liberals, who are really the high Tories of academic culture. There are, for better and worse, I think for worse, too few conservatives in humanities and the social sciences. I would it were different. And it is we who carry the load. It's we, the liberals, who are in the trenches. And I think we should get some credit for it. Now, I joined Columbia's faculty some years before, a year before the tensions arose that erupted in the great strikes and occupations of 1968. I am flowing over with war stories about 68, which don't fit in this discussion. I do recall being on the alert to intervene in fistfights between students who opposed and participated in the naval ROTC program that was then at Columbia. As students faced conscription, the faculty at Columbia and many other institutions debated whether to send their grades to draft boards as required by the selective service system. I began the successful opposition to this policy because it corrupted the relationship of teachers and students. I also opposed the ROTC program at that time because, and only because, it required exemption from the faculty's authority to make appointments and to teach, appointments to teach and to award credit towards degrees. In both cases, the state seemed to me to improperly invade the self-governing prerogatives of universities. In today's circumstances, actual and prospective, I enthusiastically join with others in pressing for ROTC's return. Why is ROTC largely absent, not entirely, from the selective private universities? We're familiar, surely here, with the bad university, good military narrative. 4 decades ago, a radical, narcissistic, anti-intellectuals, students and faculty rebelled against the high culture of the West and scholarly tradition and their legitimate civic obligations. That disaster's effects resonate today as identity politics encounters an apologetic, spineless academic liberalism. Today's counterparts of Schumpeter's anti-capitalist intellectuals and of Lionel Trilling's adversary culture sustain this unhappy turn. They replace old myths about the working class with new myths about the global victims of imperialism and capitalism, thus legitimating their attack on the high culture of the West. In contrast, the military is an exemplar of civic virtue, expressing the tradition of the citizen soldier and actualizing ideals of obligation and sacrifice, indeed the ultimate sacrifice of life and body, in the nation's service. The military is the more admirable as it strives affirmatively to be a model employer while avoiding the pathologies of affirmative action much more successfully than the universities. Now, this account embraces many truths. However, if our purpose is to understand ROTC's continuing absence from private and selective universities, it explains too much with too little. Today, opposition to restoring ROTC programs turns massively on legislation which prohibits the military service of open homosexuals. With others, I have argued in vain that responsibility for this law lies with Congress and the presidency, and that the greater good is served by restoring ROTC. The position of Columbia's administration is that we cannot have any academic program which excludes students in a discriminatory manner, but that otherwise the university is open to an ROTC program if the Department of Defense wishes to establish one. Objections to Don't Ask, Don't Tell completely dominated discussion when the University Senate voted decisively in 2005 against the return of ROTC. In debates last fall, leading to a vote expressing student opinion, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was again almost the only sole point of contention. It is stubbornly true that reform of this law must precede the possibility of ROTC's return. Now, to be sure, the civil rights frame, sincerely or not, may cover hostility to any program which educates our future officers in the armed services. However, cast as a civil rights issue, the question of ROTC ignites the hegemonic culture which celebrates equality of rights no more intensively than at universities. As Tocqueville seminally understood, equality is an appetite that, like its aristocratic predecessor, honor, grows by what it feeds on. Moreover, a military service in America has long and conspicuously validated equality in civic status and dignity. Homosexuals are making a claim, as have earlier Japanese Americans, blacks, women, and today, although less conspicuously, Hispanics. Despite obvious differences among these cases, all are driven by demands for equality of respect and by military necessity. In today's America, that necessity includes legitimizing the military as an exemplar of democratic equality. Now, to what extent does fundamental and principled hostility to ROTC persist? Now, interest in restoring ROTC has arisen among other institutions at Yale and Harvard and Columbia. At all, ROTC ended about 40 years ago. Last November, not quite half of Columbia undergraduates who voted, in turn, half of the eligible students, that is, half of those who were eligible voted. Of those who voted, half, not quite half, a shade under half, approved its return, despite sustained attempts to define the vote solely as a referendum on discrimination. At best I can judge, the modal attitudes of students is a mix of indifference and acquiescent approval. As one student put it, writing to a family member, the most interesting thing is that very few people seem to care very deeply. I don't think there's going to be a big fuss either way. And by big fuss, I mean a group of students occupying buildings or going on strike or whatever very angry students do. The issue just doesn't have the same urgency on campus that I'm told it did 40 years ago. These days, it's just one issue among many. My best estimate is that absent don't ask, don't tell, student opinion will at most favor, or at the least permit, ROTC's return. Now, the importance of student opinion is yet another evidence of American exceptionalism, but of course, there's always the faculty. Contrary to a prevailing usage, ROTC was never banned by the Columbia, or as far as I know, any other institution. The actual stated grounds for termination concerned the faculty's authority over appointments and award of credit. At Columbia, a committee chaired in 1969 by a conservative political theorist, whom I knew, Professor Harvey C. Mansfield, who was the father of the distinguished conservative political theorist at Harvard who bears his name. That committee unanimously recommended, and I'm drawing on its words, that the administration terminate the present arrangements and seek instead a relationship in which any course offered shall carry credit only if it is also listed in the offerings of a regular academic department, and in which instructors not hold academic rank unless appointed according to regular procedures. The faculties, administrations, and trustees of 15 institutions, including some of the most prestigious, adopted essentially the same position. Of course, passionate opposition to the Vietnam War drove this policy. But it was not then, nor is it now, merely a formal pretext. I cannot myself imagine ROTC's returning if this matter is not resolved. Now, the difficulty of the matter is amplified by legislation, the ROTC Vitalization Act of 1964. It has the following very plain language. No unit may be established or maintained at an institution unless, 1, the senior commissioned officer is given the academic rank of professor, and 2, the institution adopts as part of its curriculum a program which the secretary of the military department concerned prescribes and conducts. These provisions require either amendments or a very intricate and clever creative administrative negotiation. 40 years ago, many understandably understood this matter to rationalize political perspectives, embracing an anti-military posture and opposition to the government's policies. Like concern with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it may indeed cover unconditional opposition to ROTC programs sincerely or conveniently. However, to impute motives rather than take the substance of the matter seriously is to prolong a culture war which is now, in my opinion, happily ebbing. Every profession which claims prerogatives risks scorn if it does so for mere pride, simple self-interest, or hidden motives. But the prerogative of of faculty authority over appointments and curriculum touches the essence. Some members of Professor Mansfield's committee admitted, and again, I draw on their language, that if sufficiently extreme conditions should arise, as a situation similar to World War II, for example, we would be willing to grant exceptions from normal academic control over curriculum and faculty. They interpreted their own recommendation in the following terms: that they canceled exceptions from the normal academic procedures which were granted to the Navy during or immediately after World War II. We regret that we did not take such action, that is to end these exceptions. We regret that we did not take such action before the present mood on campus, but we cannot refuse to take steps to correct an academically irregular situation merely because that mood arose. Now, we can interpret this more broadly in the following sense: that faculty authority over curricular and appointments is to be maintained during times both of peace and of military engagements which are open to democratic political contestation. This offers a broad context in which to consider the military and academe, the context of American society shaping and being shaped in successive experiences of war and peace. I'm going to make an excursus here and return to the campus by means of it. From 1942 to 1946, Columbia housed a midshipman training school that graduated 23,000 naval officers. In the next quarter century, its naval ROTC program produced 1,000 commissioned officers. This trajectory runs through three distinct phases: the consensual case of World War II, sustained semi-mobilization in the Cold War, and the inflamed moment of the war in Vietnam. American memory embraces the myth of the good war, waged for an unambiguous moral good, sustained by voluntary consent, and fought by citizen soldiers. The Civil War and World War II are exemplary. To the moral passion of ending slavery, a patriotic memory adds that of a vast and fierce combat by volunteer citizens. So strong is this theme that 25 years after Gettysburg, Lieutenant Benjamin Rittenhouse of the 5th U.S. Artillery, Battery D, who commanded devastating fire on Pickett's charge from Little Round Top, where Professor Chamberlain so distinguished himself, he could write, "I felt proud of that charging column of Americans, even though they were rebels. They were citizen soldiers, American volunteers." The Second World War is the nation's closest prototype of a war, remembered as virtuous in all respects. And I'm not in touch with those textbooks that Victor Davis Hanson spoke of, I think it was yesterday, that have a different view of World War II, but my impression is that it is still remembered, at least by people above a certain age, as the last good war. Our subsequent experience of war is largely lived in comparison and contrast with it, it seems to me. Whether its myth and memory is misplaced or manipulated, or solemnly and authentically celebrated. The normative setting of ROTC programs after World War II was formed in the first 20 years of the Cold War. For the first time in its history, the nation was semi-mobilized during peace for large-scale combat. Conscription, which was intensive during the Korean crisis, was retained at levels that by design permitted the unwilling to avoid service. It was indeed, in the language of the statute in World War II, it was indeed a selective service. It was intended to influence, by a pattern of deferments and exemptions, the distribution of manpower in a growing economy, as well, of course, as recruit for the armed services. That economy, in turn, sustained a growing military at 4% of GNP. It's highly likely that some, perhaps many, students preferred participation in ROTC at prestigious private colleges to avoid a conscripted term in the ranks. But a positive or a relaxed attitude to service in the armed forces was pervasive. A term of military service was normal in the biographies of many American men coming of age after the universal mobilization of the Second World War. But a divide gradually emerged between those whose citizenship embraced a term of military service and younger cohorts who defined the obligations of citizenship entirely in terms of civilian activities. That divide sharpened with the maturation of generations after conscription ended in 1973. In 1956, Princeton graduated 400 students who went on to serve in uniform. In the class of 2004, the number was 9. I believe I drew this number from your article on the subject. The war in Vietnam was too long, was too indecisive, was too intense, was too bloody. Its strategic rationale too unpersuasive. Its conduct too unlike the last good war to be sustained at necessary levels of conscription and political consent. ROTC ceased to be a normal if marginal aspect of campus life in a semi-mobilized polity and became a vivid, immediate manifestation of a war seen as illegitimate. In the following decades, ROTC became anomalous, indeed alien, to the customs and practices of academia. And the point I want to make through this excursus, among other points, is that politically and intellectually radical positions were and are not a requisite for this posture. It has simply became part of the routine culture of the academy. With the end of conscription, the active citizen soldiery shrank to a revolving 1% of the population. The all-volunteer force is comprised of citizen soldiers in the sense that a small proportion of the 1% who are in service at any one time are career professionals. The citizen soldier is exemplary, but celebration of the ideal is broadly vicarious. As the eminent military historian Michael Howard has put it, the democratic social compact no longer involves the legitimate obligation to risk death for the nation. Now, some lament this as a decline in virtue, in the classical sense of virtue. However, it fits well with the mutation of militaries into small voluntary forces in which the semi-skilled labor of the citizen mass army has no useful place. The nation's military endeavors after September 2001 do not require extensive mobilization in terms of taxation, manpower, or popular enthusiasm. Indeed, the very opposite is true. President Bush was widely mocked for defining contributions to the very misnamed war on terror as continuing to shop and travel, and sacrifice as reflected in long waits at airports. However, his basic point survives his awkward rhetoric. The routine functioning, indeed the flourishing of civil society and the economy are not only compatible with the new form of mobilization, but among its central requisites. The private selective universities reflect this broad picture. Students are culturally and personally distant from the military, a distance informed more by incomprehension and distaste than hostility. Vietnam does not equal Iraq on campus. I was there. I was in the middle of 68 and 66 and 70 at Columbia. Iraq is not a shadow, is not a resonant, it is not resonant with the experience of Vietnam, at least at Columbia and I think elsewhere as well. The sense of citizenship of contemporary students, undergraduates, turns solely, and often eagerly, of course, on voluntary activity in civil society, and prevailingly, most unfortunately, they do not know people in military service as friends or family or neighbor. Now, to be sure, faculty and student voices which claim that ROTC programs illegitimately invade academia and which oppose ROTC for political, ideological reasons will grow. They're present. I certainly don't mean to minimize them. They are present. And they will grow louder as the issue is joined, as I believe it will be joined in the coming years, a few years. However, these voices are often amplified in conservative comment, which itself is sometimes, it seems to me, animated by resentment of the liberal presence or dominance in the humanities and the social sciences. If the necessary legislative reforms are achieved, I do not believe that these voices can block ROTC's return. It is a sign of the opposition's weakness that opponents to ROTC have thus far argued entirely in terms of the civil rights frame. They have not sought to make a substantive case. When debate on the merits is joined, I believe that we will prevail. However, my last theme, is the Department of Defense interested in returning to institutions that required ROTC to leave 40 years ago? The military has made its own contribution to the present unsatisfactory state of affairs. The bad university, good military narrative selectively recalls the convulsions of the 1960s, but is not aware of the military's long-term response. I can only illustrate. According to the Army Cadet Command's official history, and I draw on its language, the abolition of ROTC units at elite institutions along the eastern seaboard was more than offset, quantitatively at least, by the creation of additional detachments in the south and west. Some officials feared that the average quality of ROTC students would drop, and that the social balance of the Army Officer Corps would be upset. Other officials and officers were glad to see the Army sever relations with schools which, in their opinion, had never been avid supporters of the military. This division persists in all the services. Their withdrawal of ROTC programs from the Northeast, especially, and from diverse urban areas, I think not only continued but accelerated in the drawdown of the 1990s. Of course, it is driven by budgetary constraints. More young officers can be procured for less expenditure at larger institutions, many of which are happily located in culturally conservative regions with pervasive pro-military cultures. I take but one illustration, which is not chosen by chance. Virginia, with a population of over 7.5 million, has 12 Army ROTC programs, while New York City, with a population of about 8.5 million, has 2. Now, in one respect, the budgetary imperative is the military's counterpart of academia's concern with don't ask, don't tell, and faculty autonomy. All three are both real concerns, and all offer plausible cover for an underlying attitude. In the military's case, a preference for regions with uncritically pro-military cultures, an aversion towards ROTC programs in large cities, and institutions of the Ivy League type. The distribution of ROTC programs amplifies invidious distinctions in American society. 3 changes are required for ROTC to return to the selective private universities, or at least for that real opportunity to arise. I've spoken about 2 of them: the reform, if not the repeal, at least the extensive reform of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and some amendment to the law or negotiations on the question of faculty authority over appointments and curricula. The third is that the military must overcome what I take to be its own lingering Vietnam syndrome, with the cultural residue of upheavals from a time when the parents of today's undergraduates were themselves students. It should not avoid placing ROTC programs in places where the nation's military endeavors may well evoke criticism and opposition more readily than in others. It is the historical norm that our nation's wars are politically contested, and indeed, in a democracy which has fought and certainly will fight so-called undeclared wars, or wars authorized by Congress, not declared, or wars, military endeavors which indeed are not even authorized by Congress, often occurs, it would be injurious to democracy if such military endeavors were not contested. It is, of course, a corrosive civic scandal that those with privileged backgrounds and high prospects are egregiously underrepresented in military service. This inflicts both symbolic and substantive damage on the Republic. It weakens the ties that ought to bind all citizens and deprives our military of broadly educated officers who are needed now more than ever, of course. I can only hope that our new leadership, a civilian, the change of administration, and military, as those general officers perhaps whose careers began in the bitter aftermath of Vietnam, that new leadership will act to bind up the nation's cultural wounds and reach out to the splendid young men and women at my institution and others like it who will wish to serve the nation under arms.